I met Bernie years and years ago when I used to have a golf tournament down in Bermuda. And Bernie was the highlight of my comedy give to you. And Bernie, unlike me, I get angry about it.
They sit on the side. Ooh, that's funny. Next thing you know, you see it on HBO or something. You be sitting at home. That shit's mine, you know? But ain't nobody gonna believe you. First come, first.
Where did I meet you? Tell me first thing I said to you.
I don't know who this is, but I'm gonna marry him.
If you sign up for their program, you get a light-skinned, weird-faced wife that never do an interview.
The tea in Hollywood just went from lukewarm to absolute volcanic lava, and it involves a cover-up so massive that it's currently shaking the very foundations of the entertainment industry. Have you ever looked at a celebrity couple and thought to yourself, there is no way on earth that relationship is real? Well, grab your popcorn and lock your doors, because SamuelLJackson and KattWilliams just blew the whistle on what might be the most terrifying, calculated power move in Hollywood history. We are talking about SteveHarvey, the man who built an entire empire telling you how to act like a lady, think like a man, while allegedly being completely controlled, manipulated, and handled by his own wife, MarjorieHarvey. But this isn't just your standard celebrity marriage drama. Oh no, this goes way deeper into the Matrix. KattWilliams went on a warpath, exposing a highly secretive, multi-layered industry program designed to trap elite black male comedians. And guess who he named as the ultimate handler? Marjorie. Now SamuelLJackson has allegedly entered the chat with terrifying new receipts, confirming that Marjorie wasn't just a gold digger. She was an operative who actively dismantled Steve's closest brotherhoods, including his legendary bond with the late, great BernieMac. Are we looking at a classic love story? Or are we witnessing the unraveling of Hollywood's most dangerous puppet master? Let's get into it. To fully understand how deep this rabbit hole goes, we have to look back at the exact moment the structural foundations of Hollywood comedy began to fracture. For years, the public was led to believe that the bond between the original kings of comedy was an unbreakable brotherhood built on struggle, sweat, and mutual respect. We watched SteveHarvey, BernieMac, Cedric the Entertainer, and D.L. Hughley pack out stadiums, screaming, laughing at their jokes, thinking we were witnessing black excellence at its peak. But behind the velvet curtains, a much darker, highly calculated corporate game was being played, and SteveHarvey was allegedly holding the ultimate deck of marked cards. The tension between Steve and BernieMac wasn't just a minor creative disagreement or a classic case of two alpha males bumping heads on tour. According to deep industry insiders and raw statements that have resurfaced, it was a systemic campaign to completely erase BernieMac's rising star from the Hollywood landscape. BernieMac was a force of nature, a comedian who didn't rely on clean, corporate-friendly material to get a laugh. He was raw, he was unapologetic, and most importantly, the people absolutely loved him. And that exact raw talent is what allegedly sent a shiver of pure panic straight down SteveHarvey's spine. When you look closely at the timelines, BernieMac's sudden explosion in Hollywood with movies like Ocean's 11 and his critically acclaimed television sitcom created a massive power shift. SteveHarvey, who had always viewed himself as the definitive leader and the ultimate headliner of the group, suddenly found himself being overshadowed by a man who refused to play the traditional Hollywood political game. Bernie didn't bow down to executives, he didn't change his dialect for mainstream appeal, and he certainly didn't look to Steve for permission to be great. This brings us directly to the infamous 2003 GQ magazine interview, where BernieMac finally decided to stop playing nice and expose the snakes in the grass. Bernie openly stated that Steve was deeply envious of his success and had actively tried to intercept major film roles that were already locked in for Bernie. The most glaring example was Ocean's 11, where someone directly from SteveHarvey's personal camp allegedly made a desperate, back-alley phone call to the legendary director Steven Soderbergh. The goal of that call was simple and ruthless, to convince the director to dump BernieMac and hire Steve instead. Imagine the level of calculated malice it takes to find out your literal brother in comedy, a man you share a stage with every single night, has just landed a career-defining Hollywood blockbuster, and your first instinct is to try and steal the food right off his plate. BernieMac explicitly stated that Hollywood is a cold, vicious game, but he refused to lower himself to slinging mud because he knew his talent spoke louder than any backroom corporate sabotage. He possessed an unshakable confidence, stating plainly that nobody in the industry had any control over him because he maintained total control over his own soul. But SteveHarvey couldn't handle the truth being broadcast to millions of readers worldwide. When confronted with these heavy accusations years later, Steve did exactly what any master corporate politician would do. He immediately flipped the narrative, played the victim, and claimed his feelings were deeply hurt. He tried to convince the public that the journalists at GQ had entirely manufactured the drama, blowing a minor misunderstanding completely out of proportion. He attempted to rewrite history by claiming he and Bernie were best friends who shared nothing but good times, effectively gaslighting the public while Bernie was no longer here to defend his own words. The truth, however, always finds a way to leak through the cracks of a manufactured public image. Comedians who were actually there on the road, watching the backstage dynamics unfold, have begun to validate everything BernieMac warned us about. Comedian Corey Holcomb recently sent shockwaves through the internet by completely stripping SteveHarvey of his legendary comedic status. Holcomb stated flatly that Steve was never the most talented person on that tour, and that the only reason he secured the hosting and headlining spot was because he was busy bowing down, kissing up, and playing ball with the elite white network executives and producers behind the scenes. According to these unfiltered eyewitness accounts, Steve was actively bombing on multiple nights of the tour, completely unable to match the raw, explosive comedic energy that D.L. Hughley and BernieMac were delivering to the stage. Because he couldn't beat them with pure talent, Steve allegedly used corporate leverage and personal relationships with television station owners to manufacture his dominance. Holcomb went as far as to challenge the audience, telling people to look at SteveHarvey as a prime example of how a person with minimal raw comedic talent can achieve massive wealth simply by submitting to the gatekeepers and playing whatever role they demand. This exact sentiment was echoed by none other than Cathy Hughes, the incredibly powerful founder of Radio 1, who publicly labeled SteveHarvey as one of the most disrespectful, ungrateful, and self-serving individuals she had ever encountered in her entire career in media. She noted that her network gave Steve the platform that launched his massive syndication empire, but the moment he achieved a higher level of mainstream corporate clout, he completely turned his back on the very people who built the foundation for his survival. This brings us to the core of the entire conspiracy: the sudden, aggressive shift in SteveHarvey's personality, ambition, and personal life. Enter SamuelLJackson, a Hollywood titan who doesn't mince words, doesn't chase internet clout, and possesses the kind of industry immunity where he can speak raw truth without fear of cancellation. Samuel was exceptionally close to BernieMac, standing by his side through the darkest periods of his career, and even delivering a powerful, emotional eulogy at his funeral in 2008. According to explosive leaks circulating from circles close to Samuel, the legendary actor has never bought into SteveHarvey's public displays of grief over BernieMac. Samuel allegedly knows for an absolute fact that the destruction of the brotherhood between Steve and Bernie wasn't just driven by Steve's personal jealousy. The true mastermind, the person whispering toxic poison into Steve's ear, mapping out the corporate takeovers, and pushing him to isolate himself from his real friends, was allegedly his third wife, MarjorieHarvey. SamuelLJackson has been married to his incredible wife, LaTanya Richardson, for over 40 years, a relationship built long before the bright lights of Hollywood or the multi-million-dollar paychecks ever existed. Samuel has always maintained that a black man's true strength in the entertainment industry comes from staying grounded with the woman who saw him when he was absolutely nothing. BernieMac followed that identical blueprint, remaining fiercely loyal to his high school sweetheart, Rhonda Gore, for over 30 years until the day he took his very last breath. SteveHarvey, however, completely abandoned that sacred blueprint the very second he tasted major mainstream validation. He didn't just change his management, he completely changed his entire identity, trading in his history for a highly polished, heavily manicured lifestyle orchestrated entirely by Marjorie. The leaks suggest that SamuelLJackson viewed Marjorie not as a supportive spouse, but as an industry handler, a woman who specifically targeted SteveHarvey once he reached a specific threshold of wealth and vulnerability. Marjorie wasn't interested in Steve when he was a struggling comedian sleeping in his Ford Tempo, showering at gas stations, and trying to secure small gigs just to feed himself. She allegedly waited out in the wings, watching his trajectory, calculating the exact moment his income and social status aligned with her lavish desires. And the moment she stepped into his life, she didn't just occupy his heart, she reportedly took absolute control of his business meetings, his personal friendships, and his entire psychological outlook on who he could trust. This is exactly where the terrifying narrative patterns highlighted by KattWilliams during his legendary, internet-breaking interview begin to align perfectly with the reality of the Harvey household. Katt didn't just randomly attack Steve's comedy, he exposed a dark, structural industry phenomenon that he referred to as the program. According to Katt, elite black men who reach a certain level of global influence are forced to submit to a system that strips them of their organic support systems, their childhood friends, and their loyal wives, replacing them with specific, highly controlled handlers masquerading as elegant spouses. Katt pointed out the bizarre, almost robotic pattern of these Hollywood wives who managed to secure absolute control over hundreds of millions of dollars while remaining entirely silent to the public, never doing raw interviews, and shielding their pasts behind an army of public relations lawyers. When you look at MarjorieHarvey, she fits this exact description with terrifying precision. She possesses a lifestyle of unimaginable luxury, flying on private jets, sitting front row at Paris Fashion Week, and dictating the movements of a global media icon. Yet the public has absolutely no idea who she truly is beneath the surface. The narrative that SteveHarvey constantly pushes to the masses through his relationship books and daytime talk shows is a carefully constructed fairy tale designed to keep the audience blind to the dark history that made this union possible. Steve loves to tell the romantic story of meeting Marjorie at a Memphis comedy club in 1990, claiming he stopped his stand-up set entirely just to tell her that he was going to marry her one day. But what Steve conveniently leaves out of his highly emotional, tear-jerking public monologues is that he was a married man with a family when he made that calculated statement, showing an early pattern of total disregard for the women who actually sacrificed their lives to build his foundation. The transition from Steve's second wife, Mary Shackelford, to Marjorie wasn't just a simple case of a marriage breaking down and a man finding new love. It was a complete, calculated hostile takeover of an entire estate, a family structure, and a man's psychological well-being. Mary had been right there in the trenches with Steve during the absolute heaviest grind of his professional career. She helped him transition from a local comic into a national television star, managing businesses, balancing books, and ensuring their family stayed afloat while Steve was on the road building his brand. But according to the explosive public testimonies and legal documents filed by Mary, the moment Marjorie stepped back into the picture, a highly organized execution plan was put into motion to completely erase Mary from history. Mary described a terrifyingly swift process where she went from being the co-owner of a growing entertainment empire to being entirely locked out of her own home, stripped of her businesses, and completely isolated from financial resources. The most sinister aspect of this entire transition, according to Mary's emotional confessions, was the total manipulation of their young son, Winton. Mary stated under oath and in public broadcasts that Steve didn't just walk away from their marriage. He used his immense wealth, his legal teams, and his massive celebrity status to manipulate the family court systems to strip her of custody. She described sitting at a courtroom table weeping while Steve's high-priced lawyers painted a completely false narrative about her character, effectively ensuring she would lose her child. But the true driving force behind this cold isolation, according to Mary, was Marjorie herself. Mary openly questioned how a woman who routinely brands herself as a devout mother, a fashion icon, and a pillar of family values could sit back and orchestrate the total destruction of a biological mother's relationship with her son. The leaks from deep within the Harvey legal circles suggest that Marjorie explicitly demanded a total clean slate. She did not want Steve tied to his past, she did not want financial assets flowing backward to previous households, and she wanted total compliance. While Mary was being left with practically nothing, forced to watch her life's work get handed over to another woman, Marjorie was busy moving her own 3 biological children into Steve's multimillion-dollar mansion. Steve didn't just marry Marjorie. He legally adopted her children, Morgan, Jason, and Lori, completely integrating them into his financial ecosystem. Suddenly, the kids of a struggling comic who had done nothing to build the Harvey empire were flying on private jets and inheriting global recognition, while Steve's biological son from his previous marriage was allegedly being raised to view his own birth mother as an enemy. This is where the dark past of MarjorieHarvey begins to catch up with the polished, high society image she presents to the world today. Before she was draped in haute couture at Paris Fashion Week, Marjorie was deeply embedded in a completely different kind of high-stakes underworld. Investigative reports and federal court records reveal that Marjorie was previously married to two separate, notorious drug kingpins from the Memphis underworld, Jim L. Townsend and Darnell Woods. These weren't just low-level street dealers. These were high-ranking cartel associates operating massive, multi-state distribution rings that eventually drew the full attention of the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Drug Enforcement Administration. Jim Townsend was eventually hit with a massive life sentence after a major federal bust. Documents indicate that during these intense federal investigations, Marjorie herself was under heavy surveillance by federal agents who suspected she was deeply aware, if not actively involved, in the financial logistics of the operation. Although Marjorie was never officially charged, the sudden legal downfall of her kingpin husbands created a massive financial vacuum in her life. Her second husband, Darnell Woods, also found himself caught in the crosshairs of a massive federal sweep, leading to another major legal collapse. It was precisely during this period of intense legal heat and collapsing street empires that Marjorie allegedly turned her sights back toward the mainstream entertainment industry, specifically targeting a newly wealthy, highly vulnerable SteveHarvey. According to industry whistleblowers, Marjorie knew exactly how to speak to Steve's deep-seated insecurities. Steve had always craved the validation of high society, elite status, and old-school luxury, but he lacked the refinement to get there on his own. Marjorie stepped in as the ultimate stylist, the ultimate lifestyle coach, and eventually the ultimate director of his entire life. She transformed him from a comic-wearing oversized, baggy zoot suits into a sharply tailored, high-fashion corporate entity. But that transformation came with a massive, unwritten price tag. The price was total isolation. To maintain absolute control over the Harvey vault, Marjorie allegedly ensured that anyone who possessed real leverage, real history, or an authentic connection to Steve was systematically removed from his inner circle. This brings us back to the tragic disintegration of the brotherhood between SteveHarvey and BernieMac. Insiders close to the situation allege that SamuelLJackson explicitly warned people in the industry that Marjorie was operating like a highly sophisticated corporate handler. Samuel allegedly observed how Marjorie would whisper into Steve's ear, convincing him that his peers were constantly plotting against him, that BernieMac was actively trying to diminish his greatness, and that Steve needed to look out for number one. When BernieMac landed his monumental role in Ocean's 11, the narrative fed to Steve was reportedly that Bernie was taking what rightfully belonged to Steve. The desperate backroom phone call made to director Steven Soderbergh trying to sabotage Bernie's casting wasn't just driven by Steve's personal jealousy. It was allegedly a calculated business move pushed by Marjorie to secure that massive Hollywood blockbuster check for her own household. BernieMac was a proud, deeply intuitive man who saw right through the corporate psychological warfare. He recognized that Steve was no longer operating as an independent, authentic black comedian. Bernie saw that Steve had surrendered his autonomy to a corporate apparatus and a domestic handler who viewed entertainment purely as a weapon to accumulate raw power and material wealth. That is why Bernie chose to step completely away from the Hollywood social scene, stating openly that he found peace within his own home with his loyal wife, Rhonda, rather than playing the fake, smiling games required by the Harvey camp. The psychological impact of this sabotage on BernieMac was immense, even if he refused to show it to the public. To have a man you sweat with, laughed with, and built history with try to actively take food out of your mouth using corporate backchannels is a level of betrayal that cuts deep. Yet, when Bernie tragically passed away in 2008, SteveHarvey put on one of the most emotional, tear-filled public displays of grief the media had ever seen. A move that SamuelLJackson and other close friends of Bernie reportedly viewed as the ultimate act of Hollywood hypocrisy. KattWilliams completely dismantled this manufactured public image during his historical podcast appearance, pointing out the absolute absurdity of SteveHarvey positioning himself as a relationship guru and a moral compass for the Black community. Katt highlighted the reality that Steve has spent the last 2 decades writing books telling women how to keep a man, while his own personal history is littered with broken promises, abandoned families, cheated spouses, and systemic legal warfare against the mothers of his biological children. Katt openly mocked the idea that Marjorie was some magical, salvific figure who saved Steve from poverty, reminding the world that the women who actually sacrificed their youth, their sanity, and their personal ambitions to sleep in cars with Steve were completely discarded the moment the real money started rolling in. Katt's explosive critique of the light-skinned wife program sent a massive shockwave through Hollywood, because it laid bare a pattern that many had observed but few had the courage to voice. This program, as Katt described it, relies heavily on these silent, incredibly elegant handlers who manage the public personas of these elite male figures, ensuring they never step out of line, never speak too truthfully about the inner workings of the industry, and always maintain a corporate-friendly, highly controlled image. MarjorieHarvey fits this exact paradigm, maintaining an absolute wall of silence, never engaging in raw, unscripted media interviews, and allowing her legal teams to swiftly crush any narrative that threatens to expose the dark, calculated path that led to her seat at the head of the Harvey table. As the public began to piece these timelines together, looking at the destruction of Mary Shackelford, the systemic isolation of Steve's biological children, the corporate sabotage of BernieMac, and the shadowy background of Marjorie's past relationships, a massive wave of realization began to sweep across the internet. The receipts were no longer just random gossip. They were aligning into a terrifyingly clear picture of a Hollywood empire built on betrayal, psychological manipulation, and backroom industry politics. The narrative was completely unraveling, and the public was finally starting to look past the smiling, charismatic face of the Family Feud host to see the iron-fisted, highly calculated machinery operating directly from behind the scenes, setting the stage for an explosive public fallout that no amount of corporate damage control could possibly contain. The fallout from these combined revelations has ignited a massive, unprecedented firestorm behind the scenes of mainstream television networks. Executives at major production companies are reportedly holding urgent, closed-door meetings to assess the long-term financial viability of the Harvey brand. Advertisers who have spent decades pouring hundreds of millions of dollars into Steve's family-friendly syndication deals are suddenly expressing deep concern over the highly toxic, dark narratives gaining massive traction across global social media networks. The pristine image of the lovable, charismatic daytime host who brings families together is actively collapsing under the weight of these deeply investigative breakdowns. Rumors are circulating that top network executives are quietly preparing contingency plans, including potential talent replacements and structural show formats, in anticipation of a massive public relations disaster. The core problem is that the modern audience is no longer passively consuming manufactured television personas. They are actively demanding total corporate accountability. Inside sources claim that federal agencies have also begun taking a renewed interest in the financial structures tying the current Harvey media empire to previous corporate entities. Financial investigators are allegedly reviewing the historic asset transfers that took place during the highly contentious divorce proceedings with Mary Shackelford. The goal is to determine if foreign accounts, shell corporations, or hidden assets were intentionally utilized to systematically bypass standard family court distribution laws to leave the biological mother with nothing. Furthermore, the public scrutiny surrounding Marjorie's historic connection to major federal drug cases has reawakened old investigative folders. Legal experts suggest that while historic statutes of limitations may protect individuals from certain direct criminal charges, the modern financial regulations regarding money laundering, asset concealment, and corporate wealth integration are exceptionally strict. If any current media assets are found to have structural roots tied back to the illicit capital of the Memphis underworld, the entire Harvey financial foundation could face severe legal asset forfeiture. The public backlash has reached a fever pitch, with grassroots internet campaigns calling for an absolute, total boycott of all SteveHarvey branded products, television programs, and motivational literature. Viewers are actively flooding message boards, calling out the blatant hypocrisy of a man who makes a massive fortune selling relationship advice while his personal history remains completely mired in family alienation, alleged marital infidelity, and corporate brotherhood betrayals. The emotional weight of the BernieMac situation continues to act as the ultimate catalyst for this intense public anger. Fans of the legendary comedian are refusing to allow Steve to continue using Bernie's name for cheap, emotional clout on television. The contrast between Bernie's fiercely loyal, quiet family life and Steve's highly commercialized, deeply chaotic domestic reality has become far too glaring for the average consumer to ignore. The general consensus is shifting toward total rejection of mainstream corporate media manipulation. The psychological walls are closing in on the Harvey household, with close associates reporting an atmosphere of extreme paranoia and intense panic behind the closed gates of their massive Atlanta estate. Marjorie's public relations team is reportedly working around the clock, issuing swift legal cease and desist orders to independent media outlets, YouTube commentators, and digital journalists who dare to investigate her past or question her current role as an industry handler. However, the sheer volume of global digital dissent has made it practically impossible for traditional corporate legal teams to suppress the truth. Every single time a high-priced lawyer attempts to scrub a video or silence a whistleblower, 10 more independent creators step forward with even deeper receipts, more comprehensive timelines, and more explosive analytical commentary. The historic era of absolute mainstream media censorship is officially dead, buried by the raw power of public digital exposure. As the corporate contracts begin to fracture and the public demanding answers grows louder by the hour, SteveHarvey finds himself standing at a terrifying crossroads. He can no longer rely on his classic, tear-filled television monologues to gaslight the public or sweep decades of cold, calculated industry behavior under the rug. The collective voices of KattWilliams, SamuelLJackson, Mary Shackelford, and the eternal words of BernieMac have formed an unshakable wall of ultimate truth. The ultimate question that remains is how much longer the mainstream television industry can afford to protect a crumbling idol whose foundation was allegedly built on the total destruction of his original brothers and the systematic betrayal of the families who built him. The corporate puppet strings are fraying at an exponential rate, and the entire world is watching in absolute fascination as one of Hollywood's most carefully guarded, highly lucrative empires prepares for its final, inescapable systemic collapse. This entire situation leaves us with some incredibly heavy questions that demand an absolute, unfiltered answer from the community. Are we looking at a classic Hollywood love story, or have we officially pulled back the curtain on the most cold, calculated domestic hijacking in entertainment history? Do you believe KattWilliams was speaking pure facts when he exposed the existence of an industry program designed to control elite creators using strategic handlers? Or do you think SteveHarvey simply made his own calculated choices to abandon his original family and betray his brothers in comedy just to secure mainstream corporate dominance? What do you think about Marjorie's past connections to the Memphis underworld? And do you believe she was the ultimate mastermind who engineered the total destruction of Steve's bond with BernieMac? The evidence is laid out, the timelines are perfectly aligned, but the final verdict belongs entirely to you. Drop your thoughts, your theories, and your raw perspectives in the comment section below, because the community conversation is where the real truth is always found. If you want to stay completely ahead of the game, uncovering the deepest secrets, the hidden industry receipts, and the ultimate truths that mainstream media corporations are actively trying to censor, make sure to hit that like button right now. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on your notification bell so you never miss another explosive breakdown. Stay tuned, stay vigilant, and we will see you in the very next video.